Okay. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are, and whatever the time is that you're watching this particular video lecture. We are ready to move into week 5. Technically, the date's April 8th through 14, even though today is only April the 5th, and I'm doing the lecture, so you can get a head start on it, those of you who are interested in so doing. There are a couple things, well, actually, numerous things that I want to mention this morning or this afternoon or whenever you're watching it. For me, it's in the morning. It's currently a little bit before 11 a.m. The first couple things I want to mention relate to the syllabus and the assignments. I want you to be very careful that you read the syllabus, you notice the assignments, and notice the explanations that are in different parts of the syllabus, all related to the assignment, so you're doing it fully and correctly. All right, that's the first thing. Second thing relates to the book. You notice that this week you only have one book to read, book review of Estep, Anthony, and Allison, A Theology for Christian Education, 320 pages. That counts the indexes and all that. There are several comments about this particular book that I want to mention. You can tell by how many times I refer to it in my own classroom notes, where I've reduplicated some of their charts and so forth, that there are some things in the book that I really do like. However, there are a few things that I want to make particular comment about. You don't have to include these in your review. This is simply for your own benefit. On page 39 of the book, down toward the bottom of the page, they have a heading titled Content. And under that, they write, biblical and theological instruction is not unique to Christian educators, since most major universities and even some high schools offer courses in the Bible as literature. I have not done an extensive survey of every major university in the United States, nor have I examined every single high school in the United States. But I would question the accuracy of that statement on the basis of my personal experience. Are there courses on the Bible as literature in a variety of institutions? Yes, there are. Are they common? Are they in every place, in every major university, most major universities? I wonder about that. This book was printed in 2008, and in the past decade, we have moved as a culture so far away from the Bible, even as literature, that today I would question the accuracy of that statement. It would be interesting to do an in-depth survey and find out. Unfortunately, I don't have time to do that, but I'd be skeptical. On page 56, they make a statement toward the top of the page, a quotation from Shupak, and it says this: the ancient Hebrew educators perceived knowledge first and foremost as traditional, exemplary material to be passed down from generation to generation. The dominant teaching method was learning by heart, memorization. They come back to that same basic idea on page 58. Down, maybe 20 lines down the page, they have a sentence that reads, memorization was the main method of instruction and the main level of learning to be achieved. You might add that not only was the case in Old Testament times, it was also the case in New Testament times, and it continued through the Middle Ages. Learning was heavily done on the basis of memorization. Why? Because their books were rare. And to get a book was unusual, and to have a copy of a book was even more unusual. It wasn't until the invention of the printing press that we shifted gears and moved away from rote memorization into other types of categories of learning. So while they are correct, I think we have to realize that a lot of that is simply historical requirement. There simply weren't books available to everybody. And that made a big difference and depended more and more on memorization. On page 65, there is an error. An actual error in the print. Down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lines up from the bottom. It's in the sentence which reads, "The advancement of education in ancient Israel may not have risen when formal diplomatic relations with Egypt were established during the time or David or Solomon." That first or David, should be of, not or. So there's a spelling error at that particular point of the book. On page 66, something that I did in my book, you might want to do in yours. They mention on page 66, about 7-8 lines down, Paul demonstrated a basic knowledge of Greek literature. And then they give you some references, Acts 17, 1 Corinthians, and Titus. If you turn over to page 77, and what I've done is I've written page 75 in the margin at page 66, and on page 77, they elaborate on that. We're about a third of the way down the page. They say, indeed, two Athenian poets, Epimenides wrote, "In him we live and move and have our being." Aratus said, "For we are indeed his offspring." And here they're using the same examples that they gave back on page 66. So I've cross-referenced those pages for clarity and to help along the idea. All right, on page 80, on the left-hand page, on page 80, down under the words, "the inspiration of the Bible," the Apostle Paul explained that all Scripture is inspired by God. When Paul made this statement, he was referring to the Tanakh, the Bible of the Jewish people that Christians now call the Old Testament. They are exactly correct. The difficulty is many English readers probably have no idea what the word Tanakh means. This would have been a good time to describe that, define it, whatever. Now, if you go over to page 94, they refer to the three major sections of the Old Testament. Page 94, the law, the prophets, and the writings. And this is where they could have again described what the Tanakh is. The law, the Torah, that's where you get the T. The prophets, Nebim, that's where you get that N. And the writings, the Ketubim, which is where you get the K. So the T and K come right out of the law, the prophets, and the writings. They could have explained that rather than just left it vague. So I think that's another thing that they could have done in the book that would have been an asset. On page 85, there is a theological debate that goes on from time to time. Those people who are actively involved in the study of inspiration are heavily involved in this discussion. On page 85, they give you some quotations from the Bible, from Mark, from Matthew, so forth. And then they write, instead of the exact words of Jesus, the New Testament contains the exact voice of Jesus. There are two Latin phrases that are used in the theological world to describe this, and hermeneutics people and people involved in theology of inspiration of the New Testament and the Old Testament are widely divergent on this point, where the first, the exact words, the Latin phrase is ipsissima verba, and then the exact voice is ipsissima vox. Those are Latin. The first one, ipsissima verba, for the very words. Ipsissima vox, for the very voice. The question is, does the New Testament, when it quotes Jesus, is it giving a actual verbal quotation, like we would do in English, where you put quotation marks and then you exactly quote the person, or is it summarizing? Is it giving us ideas of what he said? Is it condensing thoughts? Is it the exact words of Jesus, or is it the exact voice of Jesus? I'll give you one example. On the night of the Last Supper, when Jesus was meeting with his disciples in the upper room, John 13, 14, 15, 16 give us that discussion. That discussion all went on during the Last Supper. So the question is, since the typical observance of a Passover feast, which is what that Last Supper was that Jesus had with his apostles, the typical observance of a Passover feast went several hours. And in several hours, you would have lots of discussions with lots of interaction. So the question is, in John 13, 14, 15, 16, do we have every single word that Jesus spoke, and should it all be in direct quotation marks? Or is John giving us the voice of what Jesus spoke? Now, what he said was accurate. What John wrote was exactly true. But is it the exact words in their precise order and content and delivery and so forth? And scholars debate that. There are scholars on both sides. I mean, evangelical, good men, good women who love the Lord, study the scriptures, total confidence in the scripture, believe thoroughly in the inspiration of scripture, but they differ on this. And some would say what we have in John 13, 14, 15, 16 are the exact words of Jesus. Put a quotation mark at the beginning, put a quotation mark at the end. No question about it. Those are his exact very words. Others would say, no, what we've got is a summary. It's an accurate summary. It's a true summary. But it's not every single word that was said during that 3 or 4 hour observance of Passover. It is a summary accurately recorded by John under the inspiration, the guidance of the Holy Spirit. So the question is, which is it? They don't go into that. They simply say, instead of the exact words, it gives us the exact voice. So they opt for ipsissima vox. Just to be fair, there are scholars who would differ and argue for ipsissima verba. I'll leave it to you to study that out and come to your own conclusions. I have my conclusions, and that's not part of this particular course. On page 94, I already talked about that. This is a time they could have defined the word Tanakh. One other comment I want to make, and it's later in the book, on page 251. And this is a clarification. They're talking about the church as the precursor to the millennial kingdom. And we're talking about eschatology and whether you've got one view or another, what's your millennial view, etc. Let me just tell you right up front, I think I may have already done this in a previous video. I am what you would call a classical dispensationalist. As a result, I am a pre-tribulational, premillennial dispensationalist. Now, having said that, drop down about toward the bottom half of the page, and they write a later development of premillennialism is dispensational premillennialism. First presented in the late 19th century, and typically people connect it with Darby. It has become popular view of eschatology, and then they give you some people who support that. They make a common statement here. That is that dispensational premillennialism developed in the 19th century, the late 19th century, and typically it's connected with John Darby. I simply want to say I do not believe that dispensational premillennialism developed late. Indeed, there is a book which was printed by Baker. It's an old book. It's out of print now, but you may want to get a copy of it. And I will show you the title page of the book. Here is the title page of the book. I could not actually find the book to buy a copy. I borrowed a copy from a friend and made myself a photocopy. All right, so this is titled A Bibliographic History of Dispensationalism. And the person who did it, his name is Arnold, A-R-N-O-L-D, middle initial D, like dog, and his last name is Ehlert, E-H-L-E-R-T. At one time, he was the librarian at Dallas Theological Seminary. The book was printed in 1965, which is why you're probably having a hard time finding it today. Printed by Baker Bookhouse in 1965. But in his book, it's not a very long book, but in his book, it's about 109-10 pages. Ehlert goes back to the early roots and refers to church fathers like Clement of Alexandria who support what we would today call dispensational premillennialism, takes it from the Reformation up through the year 1825, looks at it from 1825 to 1850, looks at it from 1850 up to the C.I. Scofield Bible, from the Scofield Bible on up till today, up until his day, 1965. So I think if you read Ellert's little book, 110 pages or so long, if you're like I am, you'll come to the conclusion dispensational premillennialism was certainly around well before the end of the 19th century. So that's a clarification I want to make there and help you in that particular regard. Now, we're about 15 minutes into the video. It's time to move to our class notes. So I'm on page 149 of my notebook, an article titled Moving from Pedagogy to Andragogy. And this is a critical thing concerning education. Pedagogy, by definition, deals with education of children. Andragogy, by definition, deals with education of adults. And people recognize that there is a difference. 1, 2, 3, the fourth paragraph down. Up until very recently, the pedagogical model has been applied equally to the teaching of children and adults, and in a sense, is a contradiction in terms. That is, we're teaching adults, but we're doing it like we teach children. And what they're saying is we need to make some adjustment to that. One of the things that we do as we think about the andragogical model as contrasted to the pedagogical model is observe the difference in the way adults have matured and therefore have shifted in their learning capability. Look on page 150, the second paragraph down. The andragogical model, as conceived by Knowles, is predicated on 4 basic assumptions about learners, all of which have some relationship to our notions about a learner's ability, need, and desire to take responsibility for learning. The idea is that children don't realize they have a great responsibility in the learning process, so therefore we must more and more help them to do that. The farther we get into adulthood, the more the learner is able to take responsibility. So number 1 under that, their self-concept moves from dependency to independency. Number 2, they accumulate a reservoir of experience that can be used as a basis on which to build learning. Adults have a much more experiential base from which to connect their learning experiences. Number 3, their readiness to learn becomes increasingly associated with the developmental tasks of social roles. And number 4, their time and curricular perspectives change from postponed to immediacy of application and from subject-centeredness to performance-centeredness. The idea is when I'm a child in elementary school, what I learn is designed to help me way out there in the future. But when I'm in my 30s or 40s or 50s and I'm studying, I'm looking for material which is directly relevant, that directly connects with who I am right now at this particular time. And that requires me as a learner to take more responsibility in that learning process. I'll give you a very classic, very direct application of this. When you were a child, you're in a classroom, you're under the instruction of your teacher and so forth, and that teacher takes a great responsibility for what you do and how you do it. Now, let's transfer that to Piedmont International University and your class right now at a PhD level. You are taking this class online. The fact that you're online rather than sitting in a class means that you have taken upon yourself a much higher level of responsibility. For example, I gave you a rather detailed syllabus. If we were in a classroom situation that was going to extend over a 15 or 16-week semester, we would have numerous opportunities as the class met 3 days a week for an hour each time over 16 weeks. You'd have lots of opportunities to ask questions and interact, make sure that you've got this detail and that detail and so forth and so on. But when you take an online class, you assume all that responsibility yourself. that's moved from pedagogy to andragogy. It's moved from a pedagogical model to an andragogical model. That's what we're doing more and more of as we rise higher and higher in our educational experience. Consider also, when you're in elementary school, you're studying a wide variety of topics. When you're in high school, junior high, high school, again, you're considering a wide variety of topics. When you went through your college experience, you began to narrow those topics a lot more because you had a major and a minor, and so you focused on those areas. Then once you go into graduate school, those fields narrow even more. You are learning much more precise, narrowed information. You're focusing in particular field rather than the broad general thing. For example, when I was in college, you were in college, you studied math, you studied science, you studied history, you studied English, and on and on and on the courses go. But when you're in your PhD program, that's no longer the case. You're not studying math and science and chemistry and physics. You're focused on your particular fields where you are right now. You have a major, Old Testament, theology, whatever it happens to be. You're going to have focused information. When I did my PhD studies, my major was communication, rhetoric, and public address. I had a double minor. I had a minor in classics, Greek, Roman life, that kind of thing. And that also was Greek literature. I studied classical Greek. And in my other minor was secondary education. But in my entire MA PhD program at Wayne State University, I never had a course in medicine. I never had a course in chemistry. I never had a course in physics. I never had a course in English. Those were all outside my field. I took more and more responsibility upon myself as a learner. That's the andragogical model. The other, next on page 151, notice about halfway down the page, a third reason was the observation that many evolving educational innovations, parentheses, non-traditional programs, open university, weekend colleges, online courses, throughout the world require that learners assume a heavy responsibility and initiative in their own learning. So much of what we do in our experience is what we would call the andragogical model. It's expecting you as a learner to take much more responsibility upon yourself. Okay, having said that, let's move on to page 153. Developing a lesson plan, and hopefully you've already carefully read the notes. Notice I said here, see example from Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 through 9 in my notebook, pages 227 to 245, and hopefully you've all looked at that in great detail. Notice I just want to read the introduction here. A carefully prepared lesson plan makes a teacher consider all the elements of the teaching process. Particular elements should be included and sufficient detail provided so that the teacher is confident of each aspect of the process. Let me just quickly illustrate with an experience out of my own life. When I began preaching, pastoring, I started pastoring in 1968. And I would take a few notes into the pulpit with me. All of my study material, I just, if it was in a book, it went back up on the shelf. If I studied from the Greek or the Hebrew or whatever, I studied from the Greek and the Hebrew, and it was all up here in my head. I had very few notes, went into the pulpit with very few notes. Then I took those, by the way, I've got all those old outlines. I never threw an outline away. So all of my early sermon outlines I have in my filing cabinet. Now today, I look back at those early sermon outlines. And on the day I preached them, I'm sure they made sense. At least they made sense to me. Hopefully they did to the congregation as well. But here's the thing. I look back at some of those notes, and it'll say things like this. Illustration, Time magazine article. That's it. Now, at the time I preached that in 1968 or 1969, I knew exactly what Time magazine article that was. But today, I don't have a clue what that was. I have absolutely no memory of that at all. What Time magazine article? What year? What subject? I don't have any idea. On another occasion, I would say things like, illustration, man and his dog. What man? What dog? What'd the dog do? What'd the man do? Today I look back at that, I have no idea at all what that was. So over the years, I have developed the realization that the only way I can be confident and assured that I'm going to know exactly what I'm saying is if I put it down on paper. Well, I still use paper. If you put everything into your iPad, that's fine. Just don't lose your iPad. All right? But the idea is we need to be complete and detailed so we know exactly what we're doing. Sufficient detail, capital B, I wrote, so that the teacher is confident of each aspect of the process. And I would suggest you don't ever throw things away that you have studied. Keep them, file them, be able to identify them. I had a friend many, many years ago who said every time he preached a sermon, every time he prepared a lesson, he threw away everything so that he would always be fresh. To which my response is, no, what you'll be is consistently stupid. Your life is too short to have to do the exact same thing multiple times. If I have already studied Ephesians chapter 1, and I've studied it extensively, and I've written my materials on it, why would I want to throw all that away and later have to do it all over again? Life is too short. If I live to be 200 years old, I don't have enough time to study in depth and make good materials for all the scriptures. I don't have enough life in that. So why would I ever want to throw it away? Wilkinson cautions, quote, if expectations are unrealistic, the person may never be able to teach them and may always feel like a failure. Likewise, if expectations are set too low or are negative, it is likely the person will lose interest and become an underachiever. And I think that's exactly the case. All right, I'm going to skip the rest of the introductory material. You can read that. But I gave you, this is a brief extension, a brief idea. Notice my capital H on the introduction. The following information is common for a lesson plan. Although I've only included a limited number of lines, at times the information may extend to a greater length. So for example, I said, what do I want my class to learn? What do I want to happen? I leave basically 2.5 lines. In many cases, I can summarize that in about 2.5 lines. In a few cases, I may get a little less. In some cases, I may need a little more. What teaching methods will best realize the goal? I only gave you 3 lines for that, but it may be that you're going to use you may be using multiple lesson approaches, methods, teaching methods, and you'll need more than that. So you may want to expand that or contract it depending. The outline for the class, you need to consider the life need. That's your introduction, your question that's going to get the attention, the concept you're dealing with. What lesson do you want to learn, them to learn? What lesson do you want them to apply? What kind of life response do you want? Assignments or plans for action, and then finally closing the session. And then after it's over, evaluation. And I just gave you a few questions here, but you'll notice in the back of my course notebook, I've given you several sheets of evaluation, 3 for a teaching session and 2 for a preaching session. Homiletics form A and B and teaching evaluation 1, 2, and 3. And you can use those. I want you to use those when you have people watch you and preach and teach. All right, so that's the lesson plan. Now, at that point, I want to move into speaking. Speaking and what we can learn concerning speaking. One of the things I gave you on page 156, this was a survey taken by the London Times. That's London, England, yes. They sent a reporter to America back in the 1980s, and they took a survey of 2,543 adults, and they asked, what do you fear? Notice what the number one fear was. Speaking before a group. 40% of Americans consider that. That was the number one fear that Americans mentioned. Now, things have shifted a bit. In 2016, we have a little bit different. American fears in 2016. This is on page 157. Notice public speaking, I bold typed it, is down toward the bottom of that page, 25.9. And then there are 46 more items down all the way to 6.8%. But this was a survey done by Chapman University, located out in Orange County, California. But that still tells you that 1 out of 4 Americans fears public speaking. Now, why do we fear public speaking? Why do we doubt ourselves concerning public speaking? To answer that, I want you to look at the model on page 158, the Ross communication model. Raymond Ross wrote a book, and it went through several editions. By the way, he was one of my professors at Wayne State University. I knew him personally and consider him almost a friend, an unbeliever, but a man who was very kind and gracious, and I learned a lot from him. But I want you to notice, every time you speak, every time you try to communicate, every time I'm speaking to you, there are things going on in that communication process. And Ross tries to observe the things that are going on. Now, in his model, he's looking at one person on one side, communicating with one person on another side. Now, when you're dealing in public speaking, like preaching, teaching an audience, you're multiplying your listeners, numerous. So instead of 1 to 1, now you may be 1 to 100 or 1 to 50 or 1 to 275, whatever it is. And this model just mushrooms in its size. But let's take a look at just one-on-one. Here's what's going on. The person on the left has an idea in his or her head. See the chart. This is the chart that I'm discussing and looking at with you right now. So be looking at the chart. The person on the left has an idea in the head. Now, sometimes you'll hear people say, "Tell me your idea." Nobody ever shares an idea. Nobody. What we do, we have an idea. But then I have to somehow put that idea into words that are going to communicate, and those words are going to be sent to you. You're going to hear those words, and you're going to try to reevaluate those words and recreate in your head an idea. If the idea in my head matches the recreated idea in your head, then we have communicated. But look at all the things that are going on around it. At the top of the diagram, you have psychological climate. What kind of psychological climate are you in? What kind am I in? On the right-hand side, it says context. In our case, it's an online class. That's our context. On the left-hand side, momentary mood. What kind of mood are you in right now as you're watching my video? Are you happy? Are you sad? Are you dealing with pressures in life that just seem to be overwhelming you? Is everything going wonderfully well and you have no problems? Whatever those things are, they are affecting your momentary mood, and that momentary mood affects how you understand and what you hear. And then at the bottom, you have the situation. Look at my room. You not only see me, you see part of my office. So this is part of my situation. You're in your situation. You may have a young child, a boy or girl that's outside wanting your attention as you're trying to watch this video. Who knows what the situations are? And even in our congregations, even in our teaching situations, when we're in a classroom, when we're in a church auditorium, those situations are still impacting the lives of our listeners with whom we are seeking to communicate. All right, so I've got this idea in my head. Let's go back and look at the chart in the middle. So here's the person in the middle. He's got an idea. She's got an idea. Notice it says selecting and sorting. That is, out of all my vocabulary, out of all the things I know in my head, I have to sort through all of that material, and out of that I have to select words which I'm then going to send out to you. And that's all done on the basis of my perception. Then I have to put it in some kind of a code system. I'm using the English language. But notice at the bottom of the chart it says, that comes out of my knowledge, my past experiences, my feelings, my attitudes, my emotions, all those kinds of things are involved in the words that I choose and the reason that I choose them. So then I send them out to you. That's the channel that I'm using. Right now, what channel am I using? I'm using a video camera. I'm using a recording, and you're watching the recording and listening to it over your sound system. Then you have all the signs and symbols and language and arrangement and voice action. You hear my voice. If it is a monotone, and if it seems to be quite boring, that will affect the way you listen to it. But on the other hand, if I'm active, if I'm energetic, if I'm showing enthusiasm, you'll understand differently. So the person on the right-hand side then has to get the material that is sent and then has to decode. See the word decoding? You have to take the words that I speak, you have to decode what those words are, seek to understand them as you perceive, and select and sort through all the vocabulary you have, matching up your vocabulary with my vocabulary, your feelings with my feelings, and on the basis of your knowledge and your experience and your attitudes and your emotions, you then try to reconstruct the idea. And to the extent that your recreated idea matches my idea, we have communicated. You see how complex this system is? Most of the time, we do it without even thinking about it. It just occurs. But all of that is going on every time we communicate. So that brings me to page 159, some benefits we can gain from communication principles. I asked two questions at the beginning. Who's a communicator? Each one of us is. Who's an effective communicator? Now that's a different question. So let's enhance teaching effectiveness by knowing what communication is. And we talked about this on the very first lecture that I gave you. The secular view is that communication was invented by people over a span of, who knows, thousands of years until we finally developed it. The biblical viewpoint is that right from the moment of his creation, Adam was able to use language and was therefore different from all other creatures. And up until the Tower of Babel, all people in the world spoke one language. Today, we're told that there are roughly 6,500 languages in the world. Many of them are spoken by very small groups of people. Many of them are spoken by huge groups of people. Right now, for example, English. The definition of communication. I quoted McLaughlin, I quoted Gerbner, but my idea number 3, I think it's best to say effective communication is when the stimulus, as it was initiated and intended by the sender, corresponds closely with the stimulus as perceived and responded to by the receiver. So, if I have communicated with you, then your understanding is close to what I intended. Capital C, the Christian in communication. We should be sharing information in such a way that receivers are affected in a manner that's consistent with God's Word and our lives for Christ. The church certainly should desire to use communication effectively, I said. Number 2, Roman number 2, enhance teaching effectiveness by knowing where communication works. Well, it works in our thinking. We observe things and we think through them and we use our minds. Remember Nehemiah when he got back to Jerusalem and he took time to go out and evaluate the city and evaluated it, and as a result of that was able to communicate. Sometimes in what we evaluate, we get outside help and assistance. Sometimes we do it without any outside help. Communication works in our experiences. The physical experience, which is often the primary concern, but the spiritual, which includes what we gain through prayer and reading the scripture. Communication works in our word symbols. Meaning is not limited to the words. Yes, people evaluate words. That's been going on a long time, as Job indicates. But mere words often don't communicate intended meaning. And I gave you some examples of some letters that were sent to the San Antonio Veterans Administration. I just gave 3. Notice, quote, please send me a letter and tell me if my husband has made application for a wife and baby. Now, what did that writer mean? It looks like they're saying, my husband is applying to get a wife and is applying to get a baby. That's not what he was doing. Or how about the next one? I'm forwarding you my marriage certificate and my 2 children. One is a mistake, as you can plainly see. I really doubt that this particular individual forwarded to the San Antonio Veterans Administration their 2 children. And then number 3, you changed my little boy to a girl. Does this make a difference? Well, if it actually happened and the gender was changed, yeah, that would make a difference. But obviously, the writer is thinking in terms of on a piece of paper. Instead of saying M, it said F, male to female, something of that nature. But meaning is not just limited in the words. Meaning actually is in our minds. It's in our head. It's in the mind of the sender, the speaker. I want to communicate with you and I use words, but it's also in the mind of the listener, the receiver. I said, consider the triangle diagrams below. And this is something, if we were in class, I would put these in a PowerPoint and just put them up on a screen and have one of you read them quickly. Because typically what happens, when the person reads the PowerPoint, when it comes up on the screen, they read the first one, once in a lifetime. And they read the second one, now is the time. And they read the third one, Paris in the spring. In reality, it's duplicated. Once in now is the, Paris in the. But most time when you show that on a transparency and on a PowerPoint slide and people see it quickly, they don't even see that second letter, that second word. They just don't even see it because it's in the mind. The phrase once in a lifetime is a familiar phrase, so that's the way we see it. Now is the time, a familiar phrase, so that's the way we see it. The fact that it's misprinted doesn't even enter the picture. So meaning is a variable. And theoretically, understanding may go anywhere from 0%, you learn and understand absolutely nothing, to 100%, where it is absolutely perfect. I doubt that we're ever at either end. We're somewhere in the middle. We want to get as close to 100% as we possibly can. The influence of a person's experience is a factor. So because your experience is different than my experience, we'll understand it differently. And I gave you a cartoon that shows that. By the way, did you notice that the man sitting in the chair is obviously sitting on his legs because there are no legs hanging down off the front of the chair? The speaker's responsibility is significant. Any word may possibly, I'm on page 162, any word may possibly be misunderstood. Consider the simple clause, I struck out, and I gave you a cartoon of that. So here's the man, he just came back from bowling, and he struck out. That is, he got 3 strikes in frame number 10. That's great. You want to do that. But the young boy, on the other hand, just came back from a baseball game in which he struck out. That's bad. So you use the exact same words in 2 different contexts with completely different meanings. We have abstract words that we often use. Think how many words in Scripture are abstractions. For example, God so loved the world. What does love mean? I love my dog. I love spinach. I love to drive my car. I love it when we have beautiful weather. So what does it mean? That's an abstraction. Unfamiliar words. How about supralapsarianism or infralapsarianism or sublapsarianism? Words that are unfamiliar, and sometimes even words which are clearly biblical are unfamiliar. Propitiation, redemption, reconciliation. Familiar words in the Scriptures, but unfamiliar to the meaning of many of our listeners. So meaning demands wise use of language. We need to recognize that words are symbols. They represent realities. They are not the reality. And I gave you an example here. Consider the statement, I climbed a high mountain. All right, let's suppose you live in Tennessee. The highest mountain is Clingman's Dome. It is 6,643 feet high. Let's suppose, however, that you live in Washington State, where I lived for 13 years. The highest mountain is Mount Rainier. It is 14,410 feet. I say I climbed a high mountain. That's an abstraction. It's not specific. But suppose that I were to tell you, I climbed 14,410 feet high Mount Rainier. That's no longer abstract. That becomes quite concrete. We speak often in abstractions. We need to speak more concretely. Consider the statement, it will be hot today. Well, I just went through and picked out some different cities. If you lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, the average high July temperature is 89 degrees. Some people would say that's hot. If you live in Phoenix, Arizona, however, the average high July temperature is 106. On the other hand, if you live in Anchorage, Alaska, the average high July temperature is 62. So what's hot? Well, if you live in Anchorage, Alaska, and it hits 62 degrees, you say it's a hot day. But that's nowhere near as hot as it is in Phoenix, Arizona at 106. You see how the word hot is abstract. So we need to say things as simply as possible, but we need to anchor our words to reality. And instead of saying it's going to be hot today, how about saying it's going to be 83? Or it's going to be 98? Now we're specific. And we need to do that in our communication of Scripture especially. Notice the Family Circus cartoon. I like the Family Circus. The father says, this is nothing. When I was your age, we had snow that came all the way up to here on me. And then notice his son, and notice where the snow comes up to. It's a difference of experience. It requires being vivid. Notice bottom on page 164, I said, avoid the use of cliches. They all say. Scholars agree. Not necessarily. Those are cliches, and they're not always accurate. We need to be precise. Make sentences short and crisp. I'm talking about verbal communication, oral communication. Use dialogue, rhetorical questions, personal pronouns. Requires correctness of what we're doing. Be grammatically precise. Number 3, Roman numeral 3, enhance communication effectiveness by knowing how communication proceeds. It proceeds in some basic elements. Verbal, that is, it uses words. The idea of word meanings, we've already considered that. It depends heavily on verbal elements. So we've got to overcome today's listeners are greatly influenced by that which is visual and oral. That's especially true in the entertainment media. And I gave you an illustration of the cartoon at the bottom where the teacher hands the paper back to the boy and says, your report is totally without merit. Add a color cover and some clip art and hand it in again. That is, what is it that gives you quality? Well, it's a color cover and it's clip art. That gives you quality. What about the content? But we're moving into a day when more and more it goes with that element rather than the content. I gave you a Peanuts cartoon. I like Peanuts cartoons also. It was a dark and stormy night. Good writing is hard work. Well, you may not be exactly like Snoopy, but you probably have already assumed and already found out that good work does take the good writing, good study, good efforts. It takes hard work. All right, nonverbal. That includes everything from body action all the way down to the way we use our time. Now, the next thing I did was communication steps. Typically, the way that we think about communication is in a linear fashion. That is, I, as a speaker, must apprehend my subject, I organize, I choose my code system, English, and I send out the material. It goes from me to you in a line. Then you decode it, and you give me feedback in a line back. That is, it goes from me to you, and then maybe it comes back from you to me. Linear. I would like to suggest that it's not linear, it's on a continuum. And this is where an online class like we're doing now and a video lecture like we're doing now is really difficult. I'd much rather be in a classroom situation where I can look at you and get your immediate feedback and know what you're thinking, because this particular medium that we're using is indeed very linear. But when we're interacting with people in an auditorium, in a classroom setting, you're teaching a Sunday school class, a ladies' Bible study meeting, you're preaching a sermon on a Sunday morning service, that is much more of a continuum. So you've got person A organizing his thoughts, putting it into a code system in his own mind, and then sending it out. Person B receives it, decodes it, organizes and encodes his, and then gives feedback. Even in a large audience, listeners can look at you. You'll see them nodding, or you'll see them going to sleep on you. That's feedback. And then you use that to change and modify how you then communicate as you continue that continuum. Communication proceeds in a lot of ingredients. You have the communicator. Christ illustrated the necessary factors in his own communication process. I just gave you 3 examples. John 3, when he dealt with Nicodemus. Look at John 4, how he dealt with the Samaritan woman at the well. And then compare Matthew 23, when he brought down the woes on the scribes and Pharisees. The message communicated. And out of all the potential messages, Christianity, I believe, has the best there is. The communication medium, that's oral. I'm doing that right now. It can be written. It can be electronic. It can be video like we're doing here. It can be a variety of things. And then the receiver. Enhance number 4 by knowing when communication is hindered. I made the comment, perfect communication is probably impossible. But accurate and adequate communication can be obtained, and that's what we're trying to do. It can be hindered by physical obstacles, the size and shape and the room temperature and all that kind of thing. It can be hindered by psychological obstacles, biases and prejudices, preconceived ideas, habitual expectations, an agitated state of mind. All those can have a factor. Communication can be hindered by intellectual obstacles. We're not familiar with something. We're uneducated in something. We're mentally handicapped. That's another possibility. By the way, no matter how educated you become, no matter how much you learn, you will always be ignorant about something. Sometimes we learn a whole lot about things we never expected to learn. For example, on this hand, right there, well, that's a squamous cancer. You probably can't see much anymore. That was an enormous melanoma that I had taken off last September. When the doctor cut it out, I had a gap on the side of my hand that was 2 inches in diameter, and it went down 0.57 of a centimeter to get it all out. And at the time, they think they got it all out. But in the process, I learned a lot about melanomas. I didn't know anything about them before, not like I do now. And you don't always like to learn either. But all of us are ignorant about something. You know, I think I may have mentioned before, one of the things that I believe a doctoral education will teach you is you don't know much. You really don't. You may learn a lot about a limited field, but there's a whole lot out there you don't know. So that's intellectual. It may be hindered by cultural obstacles. Alfred, for example, his cultural background is completely different than mine and most of the others in this class. African American as compared to Asian American, as compared to Hispanic American, as compared to African, as compared to just a straight Asian. Lots of differences. Upper income, low income, occupational characteristics, farmers, UAW, Boeing, Microsoft, all those people have different ways they look at things. It can be hindered by linguistic obstacles. A person may not know English or another language well, like missionaries when they go to another field, they have to learn a foreign language to them. That is a challenge at times. A person may be unclear concerning biblical terminology, may be unsure of definitions, may be unaware of a Muslim who has no concept of Christianity, or vice versa. Communication may be hindered by spiritual obstacles. The unsaved are clearly hindered by Satan. And I go on to talk about that. The carnal Christian, hindered by a lack of spiritual understanding, and only the spiritual person has the potential for the mind of Christ. My conclusion is we need to be the best communicator we can, and the Holy Spirit is our helper. And my book on persuasive preaching has a chapter on that, and you're reading a couple of textbooks, including the one that's due this week, also deals with a chapter on that. All right, let's quickly move on to listening principles. Have you ever heard statements like I gave at the introduction? That student never listens to me. Or, I wish my professor would actually listen when students ask a question. Or, huh? What'd you say? I guess I wasn't listening. Or how about, put down that magazine and listen to me? I gave you the experience of another cartoon, Sally Forth, another one that I like to read. So here's Sally sitting at her desk, and a lady comes up behind her. Hey, Sally, how are you? By the way, have you ever noticed when you ask people, how are you, often they don't tell you? Well, here Sally does. Oh, I've been better. I just can't get to sleep anymore, Alice. And, now notice Alice, she's listening, it looks like. Sally goes on, there's been so much work here and at home that my mind is never at rest. And Sally goes on, it's like life is going at twice the speed I am, so no matter what I do, I just can't catch up. And you checked out after my first sentence, didn't you? To which Alice responds, I think you repeatedly said hazelnut. The reality is, Sally never said hazelnut. Maybe I was thinking that since I was on my way to get coffee when I stopped in for what I thought would be a quick hello. So Alice is on her way to get a cup of coffee, probably hazelnut flavored. That's what's on her mind. She's not listening to Sally. And at one time or another, we've all been in exactly that situation where we failed to listen. Knowing the importance is not only today, but it's been going on for years. I quoted from the Holman Christian Standard Bible here, Deuteronomy 5, verse 1. Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, Israel, listen to the statutes and ordinances I am proclaiming as you hear them today. Learn and follow them carefully. Listen. Deuteronomy 6. Listen, Israel. It's a good emphasis. Listen. All right, so the question is, how well do I listen? And I've given some quizzes. So quiz number 1. And if I were in a classroom with you sitting around me, I would put these on again on a PowerPoint slide and you would answer it. And then we'd talk about what they mean afterward. But you've got them all before you. So write the term that best describes you as a listener. As you look at yourself, how would you describe yourself as a listener? And my guess is most of you would say you're above average, at least, maybe excellent. You wouldn't be in a PhD class if you didn't have that. Then, capital B under that, write down on a 0 to 100 scale, how do you rate yourself as a listener? So do I rate myself at 60%, at 70, at 80, at 90? Where do I put myself? So go ahead and do that. Listening quiz 2, on a scale of 0 to 100, how would the following people rate you as a listener? Your best friend, your boss, your business colleague, a job subordinate, your spouse. Listening quiz 3, how often do you find yourself engaging in these 10 listening habits? Identify them. Frequently, almost always, usually, sometimes, seldom, and never. So, for example, calling the subject uninteresting. How much do you do that? Almost always, or never, or somewhere in between. Answer each of the 10 along that way. Now, on the next page, page 174, I tell you that there is no correct, incorrect answer. But the purpose of the quiz is to help us understand ourselves. Number 1, 85% of people rate themselves as average or less. Fewer than 5% rate themselves as superior or excellent. This quiz has been given to thousands of people in university settings across America. That's where I'm getting my data. On the 0 to 100 scale, the average is 55. But the general range can go anywhere from 35, which is pretty bad, to 85, which is pretty good. Listening number 2. Most think that your best friend rates you high. And probably they do listen to you and you listen to them well. Most think your boss rates you higher than you rate yourself. And probably so, because we tend to listen to our boss because our job depends on our relationship. Most think colleague and subordinate rate you about the same as you rate yourself, because we're at basically the same level. Interestingly enough, most people think that your spouse rates you lower. Do we listen poorly with our spouse? You think about that. And the scoring key, I've given that to you. The average score that's on listening quiz 3, you can look at that and then evaluate yourself. Now, let's go to page 175, the importance of listening. And I've given some quotations from various people how we need to listen. Then I give you a chart. In education, how much time do we spend learning how to listen? Listening, interestingly enough, is learned first, speaking is learned second, reading is learned third, writing and keyboarding is learned fourth. Now, by listening being learned first, you've got babies that are just come home from the doctor, from the hospital, and parents are cooing to them, "Oh, you look so wonderful. I love you so much. We're so glad you're part of our family." And babies start listening from day one. So that's first. They start speaking when they're a year, year and a half, 2 years, 3 years. They're developing their vocabulary, but they don't learn to read until later, and they certainly don't learn to write until even later than that. Interestingly enough, we use listening the most in our communication endeavors. We use speaking next to most. We use reading next to least, and we use writing and keyboarding least of all. Now, that may be changing with the modern technology and so many people using smartphones and tablets, but at least it's going to be close. But notice how they're taught. How many of you ever had a course on listening? Now, you may have had a course on speaking, but my guess is you've never had a course on listening. How many of you have even read a book on listening? Probably not too many. So what is listening? Communication viewpoint. I'll skip the dictionary. From the communication viewpoint, it is a conscious effort using the sense of hearing, obviously, but all appropriate senses. I use my eyes. I look at I hear your tone of voice. I interpret all these things to interpret accurately and understand fully the total communication. First, get their attention. You've got to hear. And I gave you that step. Hearing becomes first. And that requires that we overcome some hearing barriers. We may have distractions, odors, temperature, another person, so forth, those kinds of things. So you got to overcome distractions if we're going to listen well. But we not only need to hear, we must interpret. So we must hear the word and accept it. This is where we start to give meaning. And it requires overcoming listening barriers. Hearing barriers may be noises and a police car siren running down the road next to us or whatever, but interpreting takes it to the next step. I've got to understand the topic, and I've got to understand what he's saying. And that brings me to the last, which is understanding. Now, then that brings me to the question, how can I listen better? I made a note. In any class or church service, you'll find Al Jones. Obviously, I'm just making up names. But you'll find this man who's fighting to stay awake because he worked all night the night before, but he's in church. You'll find Karen Smith, who's bored to tears. You'll find John Abrams, who's daydreaming about Mary. And you'll find Don Peterson, who's listening intently and even taking notes. And what will each one say about the class when it's over? Well, Al Jones, who's fighting to stay awake, may say, "Oh, man, I didn't get a thing out of that class today." And Karen Smith says, "Yeah, it was one of the worst classes I've ever heard." And John Abrams said, "Did we just sit through a class? I wonder what Mary's doing." And then you got Don Peterson who says, "Wow, that was the best class I've sat in forever. I've heard things I've never heard before. I've learned new materials that I can take and apply in my life. It was a great class." All these things going on. How can I, as an individual, listen better? Well, we need physical approach. One of those things is space. One of the problems we've got right now is the space between you and me is quite a distance. We're trying to bridge it with a video camera, but it's still quite a bit distant. Body language, kinesics, how do we move? Posture, gestures, my face, my eyes, those kinds of things. Mental approach. Am I prepared physically? A weary body results in a foggy mind. That's just the way it is. So how much sleep do you get every night? Present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, Romans 12 says. If I wear my body out unnecessarily, am I really presenting it as a living sacrifice? Good listening is hard work. I've made some suggestions on how you can improve your listening skills. Do mental warm-up exercises. Make it like a game. Connect present ideas with what's already been said. This can work even when you have a boring speaker. Appreciate the emotion behind the speaker's words. Empathize with him. For example, bottom of page 179, Acts 16:25. But about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns of praise to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. And I just noticed, I never noticed that before, my Greek letters did not print. My Greek transliteration did, but the first one is supposed to be in Greek, and it glitched, and it's giving you English, and that's too bad. But you've got the Greek word there in the italicized. Anyway, the word means to listen with rapt attention. We listen with pleasure as to a recitation or music, A.T. Robertson said. That's what was going on in Acts 16:25 as the prisoners were listening with rapt attention to Paul and Silas. Control your own emotions. Don't let a trigger word send you off on a tangent and start you daydreaming. Put aside your mental sets. In humility, receive the word implanted. Start out with this attitude: I will learn something new today. Listen with a goal. I will gain valuable insight from this message or student. Don't listen in the second person. That is, well, that's good for Professor Jones. Too bad he's not here. Make it relevant for you. Don't criticize the speaker, his clothing, his mannerisms, his voice, whatever it happens to be. Give feedback to the speaker. Now, that's tough to do in this class. You can't give me feedback, at least not as you watch the video. You can give me feedback in written communication, and I have gotten a variety of written communications from all of you, and I will try to interact with those to the very best of my ability as rapidly as I can. Fight off distractions. Don't interrupt. Don't give the impression that you want to jump in and take over. Then I concluded with an illustration. Two psychiatrists met in an elevator at the end of a long day. One was beat and bedraggled. The other was fresh, calm, and relaxed. Seeing the freshness of his colleague, the bedraggled one asked, "How do you listen to all those problems all day long and still manage to have energy left at this hour?" To which the other answered, "Who listens?" Listening is difficult, but it demands, if we're going to communicate, it demands that we do it well. We have an obligation to be good listeners, and all of us need to improve. And that brings me to page 180, and that's the end of our time for today, and I'm at 1 hour and 8 minutes. So I went just a hair longer than I usually do. Now I've got to reach back here and get my mouse so I can shut off the video, and we'll be ready to upload it onto YouTube and then download it onto Blackboard so you can have access to it. All right. Have a great week. Keep working. You've got another sermon manuscript which you're going to have to prepare and give to me, or a teaching lesson manuscript, and I'm looking forward to seeing those the second time around. You'll be presenting material, and you'll be presenting that material sometime this weekend from your first one, and next weekend you'll be presenting it again. So I'll be looking forward to seeing the results of that as well. Remember, you have to put it on YouTube, and we have to be able to look at it. Just as I forwarded to you the YouTube link of the sermon I preached at Community Bible Church, I want to be able to see your presentation when you give it. Okay, have a blessed week. I've been praying for you, trusting that God is going to continue to use you and use you even more greatly in the days, weeks, months, and years ahead until the Lord Jesus comes and receives us to himself. Have a great day.